This is the virtual symposium, Our First Peoples, Leading Us Toward Environmentally Sound and Sustainable Communities, hosted by the Santa Rosa First Peoples and the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Our Santa Rosa First Peoples will now open the proceedings with an invocation.
Ehe, Papa Tamushi Adayali Wachinachi Ehe. O great Spirit, creator of the heavens and of the earth, our creator, you have brought us together, not physically, but through this technology. You have brought us together and you will link us together as we continue to share our experiences on our first peoples of the region. We invite your divine presence to take control of the proceedings. We remember the ancestors who have gone before us, and we pray that you will continue to give them peace and that you will continue to use them to inspire us in our dreams and in our visions. Oh, great Spirit, we thank you for this day. We thank you for each other. And we ask that you will bless this proceeding and that the discussion that will take place will result to your honor, to your glory, and to the welfare of not only our first peoples, but all the peoples we live together with in our respective regions. You dwell in the highest heaven, and you have placed us upon the lowest earth. And from the lowest earth we send our prayers to you. And we ask for the guardian spirits, those of the east, those of the west, those of the north, and those of the south, bear witness to our prayers. Ehei, Papa, Tamushi, Adayali, Wachinati, Ehei, Ehei, Ehei. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, Dean, Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and I have the honor of moderating this event put on in celebration of the Santa Rosa First Peoples Heritage Week, the first time virtually, and my first task is to greet all of you. Honorable Member of Parliament for Rima, Mrs. Penelope Beckles, Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Lands and Fisheries, Mr. Clarence Rambra, our Santa Rosa Queen, Ms. Nona Akwan, Chief of the Santa Rosa First Peoples, Mr. Ricardo Barrett Fernandez, Indigenous leaders from across the region who are celebrating with us and teaching us today, our very special feature speaker, Professor Maximillian Forte, Indigenous people, staff, students, the media, ladies and gentlemen in Facebook land, and all of you, welcome to you all to this special virtual symposium, Our First Peoples, Leading Us Toward Environmentally Sound and Sustainable Communities, hosted by the Santa Rosa First Peoples and the Faculty of Law. We at the Faculty of Law are honored to have been invited by our First Peoples to partner with them to host this event. It is an important input to our mission of legal education in the community. The First Peoples are important friends of the faculty, and we are committed to their mission of elevating the consciousness of the nation about their historical contributions and their value to future development in this nation and beyond. This seminar, we hope, will explain some of the why. We are joined this morning by Indigenous communities and leaders from across the region to celebrate with the First Peoples in this Heritage Week, but more importantly, to teach us about Indigenous values and principles as we move toward a sustainable future. Now more than ever, the need for environmentally sound and sustainable pathways are imperative. To all our presenters and to our audience, please note that I have acknowledged our dignitaries on our collective behalf, and we ask that other speakers move straight into their presentations. Remember to unmute as we go along when you speak, and there is no need to repeat the protocol list. Our first speaker I present to you is our very own Chief Ricardo Barrett Fernandez, a true warrior or Santa Rosa First Peoples and all indigenous peoples. Under his leadership, the community has seen many gains and the country has begun to remember. He will give introductory remarks.
Thank you so very much, Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine, Dean of the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. It is with a feeling of deep satisfaction that I welcome you all to this virtual conference, when in 2017, we celebrated our national holiday under the theme on becoming visible towards meaningful recognition. We never dreamt that such remarkable visibility would take place as this conference. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, we are unable to gather with our local First Peoples and visiting contingents as in the past. But here we are, reaching out to Trinidad and Tobago, the membership of the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous Peoples, and internationally. Today is indeed another historic and momentous occasion for the First Peoples of the region. The 12th of October is celebrated by different populations for different reasons. For Europeans and Americans, it is the celebration of Columbus Day. For his part in bringing Europe to our part of the world. For us, it is a reason to celebrate our victories and survival in spite of the merciless attacks on our populations and our loss of sovereignty. I call to memory the many chiefs, medicine men, warriors, and dedicated men and women who have passed to the next life, such as the last known chief of the Santa Rosa First Peoples, Pablo Lopez, past Carib queens such as Dolores Medrano, Maria Wirgis, Edith Martinez, Justa Wirgis, Valentina Mavis Medina, and Jennifer Cassar, as well as journalist Elma Reyes, all of whom have left us the legacy of ways to bring about sustainable livelihoods. We salute them. Their labor has not been in vain, and the baton has been passed to other stalwarts like Irene Medina, Patricia Eli, Jane Superville, Christo Adonis, and other descendants who proudly say, we are still here. The theme for the conference is Our First Peoples Leading Us Towards Environmentally Sound and Sustainable Communities. This theme reflects our spiritual worldview that all animate and inanimate things on this and all other worlds have a common root and origin. Life is a continuous interplay of matter and spirit, and everything has a spiritual dimension, which is the fundamental aspect of existence of all creatures. The planet Earth, or Mother Earth, is given to human beings to live and occupy as caretakers with an eternal duty to protect and nurture its sacredness. Human beings are allowed to live and produce on Mother Earth only through sustainable means, and the indigenous worldview prohibits human beings from trading land for money or engaging any activity which destroy our Mother Earth. Even if in today's world, First Peoples take loans to upgrade their property, there should still be an area of land, a special space that is owned collectively, so that in the event of foreclosure, our people will still have a place to reside. Based on this profound philosophy, the First Peoples have been living on this twin island since time immemorial and have nurtured sustainable ways of life. With the arrival of the European colonizers and later the migrant populations, the cultural heritage of the First Peoples underwent catastrophic changes. Land was stolen from our ancestors to make room for the colonizers. Land rights, access to land and control over it and its resources are central to indigenous peoples throughout the world. And we depend on such rights and access for our material and cultural survival. In order to survive as distinct peoples, there is a body of knowledge and skill that is distinctive to the First Peoples communities. The most important of these are the knowledge and use of indigenous flora and fauna, traditional agricultural activity, basketry, distinctive house building skills associated with thatching and tapia or adobe, as well as the planting and processing of indigenous crops such as cassava and corn. In today's global village, the cuisine of every nation is enjoyed by all, but the debt that society owes to the First People for this bounty is immeasurable. It is a little known fact among the general population that the First Peoples established the foundation for the sustainable agriculture and other forms of sustainable livelihoods that are enjoyed by modern day Trinidad and Tobago, and I would imagine other areas where indigenous peoples live. Researchers such as Professor Brinsley Samaru, Mr. John Stallmeyer, Dr. Jerome Tilok Singh, Dr. Satnarayan Balkaran Singh, among others, bear this out in their writings. Our ancestors never regarded the newcomers as competitors. Rather, they shared their skills in teaching the new settlers about planting cassava and making casserie, katara, pepper pot, etc. The Nipuyus gave the settlers their native stock, pineapples, cuttings, avocados, and pepper, seeds, sweet potatoes, guavas, etc. Even before the African arrivals, the indigenous peoples had introduced the Spaniards to pigeon peas, cucumbers, pumpkins, melons, and share their hunting and fishing skills so that others could share in food from the forests. Our ancestors used ruku not only for adding color to food, but especially for making a dye which colored their clothing, headbands, and their bodies. They constructed well-ordered cassava plantations, arrowroot, sweet potatoes, and many other indigenous crops. Their gardens grew tobacco, and which is used as a sacred herb in many different rituals of our First Peoples. Our ancestors respected the forests. Why? For them and for us, their descendants, the forest is the grocery, pharmacy, hardware, and school of the First Peoples. What do I mean? Most of the food, medicine, building, and craft material comes from the forest. The forest is the pharmacy because it produces most of the medicinal herbs. Most of our pharmaceuticals are developed by scientists working with indigenous peoples to learn the medicinal properties of these various herbs. The herbs do not only provide medicine outwardly, but also internally for the spirit. Hence, we take herbal baths. The older people listening to this conference know the herbs that are crushed for the healing properties to be extracted. However, centuries of European cultural influences have also brought about cultural transformation within the communities. Consequently, much of the cultural practices are under threat of extinction. It must be noted that it was only in 1990, 30 years ago, that the Santa Rosa First Peoples community, formerly known as the Carib community, was recognized by the then government as the representative of indigenous Amerindians of Trinidad and Tobago. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples clearly states that, and I quote, in order to survive as distinct peoples, Indigenous peoples and their communities need to be able to own, conserve, and manage their territories, land, and resources. End quote. This brings me to the plan for the establishment of our First Peoples Heritage Village and Living Museum. The village is to be a physical space that is continuously used for the regeneration of knowledge, re-establishment of First Peoples values, behavioral patterns and traditions, for the ongoing development of sustainable living systems, protecting the environment, sharing the natural resources with the rest of the population, and in living in harmony with neighbors and nature. The activities of the village would conserve, preserve, and sustain the cultural legacies of our First Peoples of Kairi, now known as Trinidad. We need to be enabled to do so on the 25 acres currently made available to us. The village to be established on it will help to permanently preserve the way of life of our Indigenous peoples and restore our ability to hand down our cultural heritage to future generations. In one of his publications, John Stolmeyer states that in order to regain a sustainable human culture of peace, we must model society, education, and economy on natural processes, ecosystems, and on the needs of the whole. He is suggesting to look towards the pre-conquest cultures as an example of how we can best restructure our societies and our lives. It is the First Peoples culture he was referring to. The establishment of the village will take place in 5 phases. Along with the construction in each phase, agricultural production and reforestation will take place. Phase 1, construction of pyramidal square traditional village with traditional houses for various members of the community. However, this village will remain a dream if the necessary human, physical, and financial resources do not become available. Day by day, we see buildings around us on which government and successive governments have spent significant funds, but which citizens do not make full use of, some of them not in use at all. This village will not be so. In our small museum here at present, we accommodate over 10,000 students per year, from preschool to tertiary level, longing for the experience which this facility will provide. This project is meant to empower the First Peoples, preserve the rich cultural heritage, and educate the nation's children, adults, and those visiting our shores. I hope that apart from government, other institutions and corporate Trinidad and Tobago will invest in this village. It will be a major cultural and economic flagship project, not only for the sustainability of our First Peoples, but for Trinidad and Tobago as a whole. As I have said before, we here in Trinidad and Tobago have attained a high level of visibility, but we still need to do more. Our ability to achieve this level has been with the support of the contingents from the region who have traveled every year to our shores to help us build this capacity. We know that in your own communities, you face many challenges. And we have also supported your cause. It is our hope that post-COVID-19, we will continue to cooperate with each other. We will be able to meet physically in celebrations as we have had in the past. As I close, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks to all of you for your past, present, and anticipated future support. May the Great Spirit, Tamushi Adayali Wachinachi, bless all of us in our journey towards meaningful recognition and environmentally sound and sustainable communities. Once again, my thanks to Professor Rosemary Bellantwine for partnering with us, and for all our brothers and sisters who have joined us, as I said previously, who are joining us today, and who we hope will join us in the future physically once again. Thank you, and very good discussion.
Thank you, Chief Fernandez, for that important lesson. This morning, we are very privileged to have celebrating with us our renewed Member of Parliament for Arima and a friend of the First Peoples. She always makes time for them. I myself saw her at the inauguration of the new Queen last year. And of course, I'm speaking of the Honorable Ms. Penelope Beckles. I'm not sure if she's part of the Indigenous community, but I know that her heart and spirit is with them. And Minister Beckles will now bring greetings.
Thank you very much, Professor Antoine. And so lovely to be on this program and to know that you are playing such an important role in this symposium. I would like to express my gratitude and delight to have been given the privilege to bring greetings to our First Peoples, as well as the speakers and guests of this most august forum. It is so important to open dialogue and facilitate continued conversation on the subject of our First Peoples. Arima is famous for many things, but foremost among them is that Arima is the home of the Santa Rosa First Peoples Carib community. This community is recognized by the government as a legitimate representative of Trinidad and Tobago's indigenous peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a milestone in solidarity with indigenous peoples and the global community. As a former Minister of the Environment, I'm extremely pleased that the environment is the focus of today's symposium. Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to others and to the environment. They are deeply connected to Mother Earth. The Environmental Management Act 2000, developed with the support of UNDP and UNEP, provides Trinidad and Tobago with a comprehensive legislative framework for promoting sound environmental management policies and practices. The preamble to the Act identifies management and conservation of the environment as a shared responsibility, requiring cooperation and coordination so much that our First Peoples can contribute toward a sound environment, particularly at the community level. Nearly 70 million Indigenous women and men depend on natural environments for their livelihoods, and many more are farmers and pastoralists. These communities thrive by living in harmony with their surroundings. Research shows that where Indigenous groups have control of the land, biodiversity flourishes. There are an estimated 370 to 500 million Indigenous people in the world, spread across 90 countries. They live in all geographic regions and represent 5,000 different cultures. Platforms such as these raise awareness of the importance of the conservation of our environment, as well as lessons to be learned from our First People. It is noteworthy that there is representation here at this symposium from Guyana, Belize, Suriname, Guatemala, and St. Vincent. Our region of Latin America and the Caribbean is well represented. I trust that you will share meaningful dialogue and insightful conversation that result in concrete recommendations for the furtherance of a sound environment, and I look forward to learning of the outcomes. On behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago and the people of Arima, I bring greetings for a fruitful symposium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Beckles and Member of Parliament, more importantly, for Arima, the home of the Santa Rosa First Peoples. I now turn to one of our special guests, We know that the Indigenous community in Canada is one of the strongest in the world, and they have continued to walk the path with our own First Peoples, helping them in the struggle. And this morning we have a representative, a leader, Mr. Gerald Roberts, who will bring a cultural presentation and greetings.
Mondo Mabrika, Giopan Nanitan. I'm Gerald Roberts, and we come from our home. We are in the territory of Nasasaguya. Joining me here today is my family. First of all, Peter Gay, and my daughters, Jessie Lee and Israel Rain. And it's very traditional that in this area, we are in the area of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas of New Credit. And so to acknowledge that, we have Candy, and she is just going to give a short blessing in the language. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Segundo, we meet again. What Conwerlado, thanks and respect and love to all of you now in this moment. Ganikihaga ni waguan jota. I'm of the people of the Flint. Wahquaho. Wolfkind is the clay that I am made from. Jage, Nidewagenu, where the group split is where I'm from. And Zit Garundo Genakele. I am now living where the trees stand in water in Toronto. I'm gonna get Haga de Leonsta. I'm learning my language of the people of Flint. So I'll start by giving the Ohanugo Ndekwa, which is every morning as soon as we open our eyes. Traditionally, we're actually supposed to give this Thanksgiving address as soon as we open our eyes to all of creation. So I'm not going to explain the whole thing. I will start by giving thanks to all of the humans around the world, all the different kinds of humans. And then our Mother Earth, the water, the fish, the plants, the medicines, the wild animals, the trees, the birds, the winds, the thunder beings, which are the ones that come to us to heal our medicines during the thunder, heal us and bring medicine during the rainstorms, the sun, the moon, the star nations above, and the four beings, who we actually ask permission to come on this earth to learn lessons as human beings. Skanya Dari, or peacemaker, and Sungwatizu, creation as a whole and our creator. So, Ona Serohansiotste, Ganjo Kwa, Ii, Galiwadekwa, Nohandu, Galiwondakwa, Neganukula Dusera. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa, Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Ungwet Supa, Ene Aguero, Skana Agahage, Eto, Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa, Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Yatiknistaha, Ji Openjade, Eto, Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa, Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Aguero, Gahneganun, Ji Openjade. Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Ganjo Su'a, Ne Awange, Sago Duru. Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Aguero, Nene, Unute Su'a, Ne Utunduni, Ji Openjade. Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Unungwa Su'a, Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Garuta Su'a, Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Ganunda Su'a, Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, Ne Uzida Su'a, Eto Nidu Hagi Wat Gura. Aguero, Aska, and Zidewa Wehnuma Gura. Deetin, Waradu, ne yuwere larges, eto ni duhan wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. De tin foradu ne la de werlas, eto ni duhan wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. Ijroch ni foradu ne atro gia, anje ginaka gurakwa, eto ni duhan wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. De tin foradu ne ti solta asunta nega wehni barhe eto ne du havi wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. De tin foradu ne yod stopalu no zitka huhiade eto ne du havi wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. De tin foradu ne gayeri ni werge zitka huhiade eto ne du havi wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. Ijroch ni foradu ne sandario eto ni du havi wat ngura. Agwego aska anzi de wakwe ni wat ngura. Ijroch ni foradu ne sungat tilu eto ni du havi wat ngura. Eto ook wach kaderi wat kwen eto ni gwange takno ona eto.
So that's a blessing that's spoken upon the land. And we, as Garifuna people that are here, we have had the honor of being wampum carriers of the Grand River Six Nations. And so we always try to walk in harmony, honoring always the First Peoples, because we believe that's the order. And as the elder brothers, we need to show that love, and we need to always speak in a way that brings healing. Yawana Noah, you know. And so it's a short time this morning, but we just wanted to give you a flavor of how we walk. And we miss being on the land of Kariri, and we look forward to meet again and to learn, and I hope to bring other people like Candy, you know, because as indigenous peoples of the Americas, you know, we want to open up those trade routes again and learn from each other and make each other strong, you know, because that's so important. So we send our blessings and we say Maruka, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. And it's so good to be a family, and you get to see Jessie. We haven't seen her for a long time, and of course, it's met Israel from last year and the years before. And then, but there's more to show you. More people, more blessed souls that want to share in our vision, you know, for the community. So, Maruka.
Maruka, morning, and thank you so much, Gerald Roberts and family, for that very moving contribution. I think it's especially important to hear the language. Language is so important to identity and indeed for sustainability. I know in the Caribbean, Guyana and so on, there's a trust towards trying to ensure that that language survives. So thank you so much. And yes, we look forward to seeing you in person next year with your friends and family. I now move on to another very special contribution, this time from Belize. I don't think we interact enough with Belize and Trinidad and Tobago. You know, it's one of the weird things about modern development. We have to go to Miami in order to get to Belize, although it's part of our community. But we have come to know the indigenous peoples of Belize, who not so long ago won an important legal battle before the CCJ. And to bring us some important remarks representing one of the indigenous communities in Belize, we have Mr. Roy Cayetano.
Mabriga, busut na hon so anigo, uwembu nugunda na halayalu na fare ha huma. Watu na lubaiti hawag hahari wa yunago, lo ma lubafu sunte gabafu, lo lichugo, anichugo nulu garati mala na fare ha huma. Our First Peoples, leading us towards environmentally sound and sustainable communities. In line with that theme, which I believe is well chosen, I would like to share with you lessons from Aubu Amurinu, I for you, you for me, which is an idea that defines the Garifuna people, defines Garifuna Duo, defines being Garifuna. The Garifuna people are the result of a mixing of Kalinago and Africans on the island of St. Vincent. They resisted British domination for a long time. And after a war that lasted something like over 30 years, continuous war, they were eventually defeated and rounded up, taken to the island of Baliso, in which they were imprisoned from July 1796 to March 1797. 4,338 persons were interred on that island. On the 11th of March, 1797, after 8 months or so, 2,248 survivors were loaded onto 11 ships to be taken away to destination that they were not aware of. This means that 2,090 had perished on that island, nearly half of the number that was rounded up. And then on the 12th of April, 1797, 2,026 were unceremoniously dumped on the island of Rotan, off the coast of Central America. Again, in the transition, the travel from Baliso to Central America, another 222 perished. Why am I giving you this background? So that I can lead into what makes us Garifuna, the idea that makes us Garifuna. We have a rich culture, but we are not, even though our clothing, our language, our music, our values are very important, we can sum it all up into 4 words: Aubu Amurinu, I for you and you for me. It is not surprising that this is not surprising, because it's a value that is common among indigenous people. It already existed on the island of St. Vincent among the Kalinago and the Garinago, but the experiences during the resistance, the experiences during the internment on Baliso, the experiences and the forced exile, the removal from the homeland to Central America, strengthened that idea. The idea of whether the individual good was more important than the collective good. This principle of Aubu Amurinu, I for you and you for me, permeates every aspect of Garifuna life. And it is on that the harmony that should exist in our lives and in the world around us resides. Garifuna spirituality is about the establishment and maintenance of harmony in the environment. If the individual or the family does what it is supposed to do, then all will be well. If we meet our obligations, all will be well. If there's harmony between the individual and his environment, all will be well. When that harmony is disrupted, then things fall apart and bad things begin to happen and corrective action become necessary. Aubu Amurinu operates at the physical level, the level of the physical environment, the social environment, and the spiritual environment. The physical environment, needless to say, is comprised of all the things that we see around us: the land, the air, the water, the sea, and so on. We draw sustenance from the physical environment. The land ties, that is, unites past, present, and future generations. We all walk on the earth the way and draw our sustenance from the earth the way our ancestors did, and the way those who are to come after us will. We take care of the land and the sea for future generations and share their use with others, but we are not the owners. The owners are those who are not yet born, those who will succeed us. If we take care of the land and the sea, they will yield rich harvests to us and our descendants. On the other hand, failure will result in bad things happening. So we take care of the physical environment and it will give to us, it will take care of us. It operates at the level of the social environment, that is, the people around us, our families, our neighborhoods, our communities, and so on. As individuals, as an individual, Garifuna, I am weak, but as a member of a group, I am strong. We are not concerned about self, but about the collective. We abhor stinginess and selfishness, and we value generosity, because that is what made it possible for us to survive our travails in the past. We share with others, we help one another. And that is why travel writers and anthropologists have described the Garifuna as clannish, because we look after one another, and I hope that it is a value that we never lose. The stranger is fed and sheltered. Harmony is maintained when we share, and there are ample returns when we honor these values. I for you and you for me also operate at the level of the spiritual environment. The spirit world is composed of the Great Spirit, who we refer to as Bungiyu, Sunte Gabafu, and other names. It includes the Ahari, that is the ancestral hosts, the spirits of the ancestors, as well as the spirits of the unborn, and other spiritual entities, some malevolent and some benevolent. There is the oneness of life, and life is joined, not separated by birth and death. There are obligations to the Great Spirit, there are obligations to the unborn, and there are obligations to the ancestors. If we maintain those obligations, if we fulfill those obligations, harmony is maintained and good things happen. But when we fail, again, bad things happen. I would like to remind listeners that the forces of de-indigenization are ubiquitous. We find those forces in the education system, we find them in religion, we find them in the economy, we find them in the legal system, and so on. The challenge for us as Indigenous people is to rediscover and return to our cosmological moorings that focus on the common good as opposed to the good of the individual. We have seen what capitalism, which is based on individualism, and individualism has done to our world, where greed, the greed of the individual, does not preclude the taking advantage of the most vulnerable among us. Only by rediscovering our values and returning to our cosmological moorings can we as Indigenous people build environmentally sound and sustainable communities. Thank you for your attention. Mabi.
Thank you. I for you and you for me, collectively guarding the earth. Very deep and moving and important thoughts. And I think it actually leads well into the next presentation, which actually is my presentation on behalf of the Faculty of Law and the University of the West Indies. And I'll be looking at how the law responds to those ideas. And certainly there's perhaps no better time than the now to be speaking about sustainability in a world which has been rendered fragile by COVID-19 and hurricanes and forest fires and earthquakes and climate change. And the very land seems to be rebelling. When we worry about food insecurity and our very survival, we look for answers. Just last week, our national budget promoted agriculture as a way forward. Even as we reach toward the promise of technology and digitization, we are confronted with the awareness of their frailty. How easily the wheels of powerful industry ground to a halt with one virus from the natural world. It turned upside down our entire carefully constructed so-called development. We forgot that man is like grass, as Isaiah tells us. Without nature to sustain us, we wither away. But before our eyes, we have our first peoples and all of our indigenous peoples who can teach us so much, not just about survival, but about learning to live with our environment, Mother Earth, as a friend, not an enemy. Surely the key to sustainability. I maintain that we must first make our first people's communities sustainable, vibrant, and visible, reversing the centuries of neglect and abuse if we are to unlock this key to genuine development. We must seize the moment. So I focus on law as a tool to create sustainable communities for first peoples and by extension, the nation. We are familiar with the violations of human rights against indigenous peoples by imperialistic and uncaring states involving, of course, genocide and cultural loss. But yet, as Chief said, we're still here. We may be less aware of the scandalous role of the law in this process, how law was used to frustrate justice, a tool of exploitation. It didn't only happen upon conquest when Columbus came. No, this process of displacement and disenfranchisement went on for centuries, and law was used as a weapon to destroy indigenous people's rights. Through the law, the land that the first peoples owned throughout this nation was stolen for an alien legal process of individual title, distortions of property law and contract and how title was held. In indigenous culture, as you have been hearing, the land belongs to us all. So that land is held in community, not in individual property rights. So this was an abuse of the legal process and a violation of the rule of law. This fraud resulted in the lands of indigenous peoples being stolen. For example, if a woman married outside, like the Spaniards, they lost the land. In their Rima mission, the indigenous peoples were defrauded out of their hegemony. In fact, once the entire east-west corridor were indigenous peoples' lands. In 1828, even after plunder, they had at least 1,320 acres, not just the 24 acres handed out from the state today. But the fraud allowed the imperialists to treat Kairi, Trinidad, as Tierra Nullis, land without a people, as recently as the 19th century, causing displacement, dispossession, and disadvantage. Not because of any wantonness on their part, but through deliberate political and legal violence. In recent times, the church, the Catholic Church, was involved in this process, has worked harmoniously with First Peoples, but it was not always like that. And we now have the opportunity to use the law to liberate the world past, to restore rights and create a sustainable future. Modern international law does give us that route to address these travesties and reestablish rights for indigenous peoples. It entails more than cultural hegemony, but extends to rights to property, self-governance, and includes the right to prior consultation. That brutal march of history robbed not just indigenous peoples, but the world of valuable contributions of all indigenous peoples, particularly in relation to sustainable models of development. So much of the law today is focusing on remembering, recognizing, and reaffirming those contributions and reclaiming rights and dignity for indigenous peoples of the world. We are waking up and remembering that indigenous peoples have a unique and valuable approach to existence, which demonstrates creativity, conservation, and utility, prioritizing harmony with the environment, and even a spiritual connection with the land in all of their practices, agricultural and otherwise. So one principle, for example, is that nature provides us with bounty, but we must understand how much is enough. Take only what is needed, what we call today a principle of environmental conservation at the core of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these principles have been identified as legal principles. In the landmark case of Maruka from Suriname, concerning the clash between land rights and extractive industries, The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights referred to this value system based on a spiritual relationship with the environment that is inherent in indigenous peoples. It established a precedent for granting collective rights to land and its natural resources on the basis of historical occupation and cultural affiliation. Indigenous peoples' belief system, premised on community and harmony, not individual greed and possession, is conducive to better ways to sustain the earth through broader notions of collective rights and responsibilities to the land it is. And that is very different to legalistic notions of legal title. Community ownership and responsibilities to the land extend to where one plants or hunts or fishes. But yet, many of these important resources, tangible or intangible, have either been lost or exploited, of course, or remain vulnerable to extinction because of a failure to protect them for the benefit of mankind. But law allows us to reclaim these concrete rights, including to stolen lands, water resources, and control over future mineral interests on the land. In the landmark case of Maya Alliance case, the Maya peoples won customary land rights in Belize. The CCJ went to the Inter-American Court and then to the CCJ, reminded us that state policies must protect the identity, dignity, social and cultural values of Belize's indigenous peoples. They saw it as reparation in the recognition of the customary land tenure rights of the Maya people in southern Belize, a form of redress for the centuries of oppression endured by the Maya people. It is a recognition of anthropological and historical significance, which gives legitimacy in the legal route to establishing indigenous rights, the ownership of land and resources. So we've had to go to anthropological evidence to make the case. First, peoples deserve the opportunity to work towards sustainable communities and environments, not as a privilege or a favor, but a right firmly established in law. How can we use the concept of rights to bring about meaningful change and productive value to indigenous peoples? I hope that the state and the church can lead the way in reparations, not necessarily for land only. The church, for example, can open up its archives and let the truth be told so that we can reveal the anthropological record. We need that to ground legal rights. In Trinidad and Tobago, we are often afraid to speak of these things and we look for handouts from the state. We are very grateful for the 25 acres released to the First People some years ago, but there is need for so much more, especially in these perilous times when we must return to Mother Earth. And no, I'm not suggesting that we take back the land that was stolen at this point, although I think if First Peoples were to make a challenge in court, they might well be on firm legal ground. But reparations is really about trying to repair the damage, and we can use alternative ways. So it could involve a symbolic return of indigenous lands, using up unoccupied lands in the country waiting to be tilled, not just for their own use, but because their use of land results in a guardianship of our heritage for the benefit of us all. First Peoples can partner with the state and even the private sector to engage in meaningful large-scale green projects. These will sustain not just the community, but the nation. Minister Rambaran hopefully will tell us about that. But state commitments must be realistic. We can't just give land, we have to make sure it is viable. It must be surveyed, lawyer fees have to be paid, and so on. I know of private gifts to the Santa Rosa people still awaiting land surveying. So there must be pragmatic routes to achieve these sustainable objectives. Although First Peoples have a long history in agriculture and conservation, we need to mesh their ancient skills with the environment with responsible agricultural practices of the modern world. And I think UV has a role in this, and give them the tools to empower them to teach us. We know them for their corn and cassava, and of course, there are other things like cocoa, avocado, and so on. But there may be more viable crops today. I point to the emerging cannabis marijuana industry as an important example in this modern trust. We have already decriminalized and are about to pass legislation for an industry in cannabis. I'm a little biased here, speaking as the chair of the CARICOM Marijuana Commission, but one of the concerns in our report was the need to ensure that traditional farmers, the small man, have a stake in the emerging cannabis industry and giving assistance to this. And I think that might be an important opportunity for First Peoples, already grounded in natural herbal remedies, agricultural know-how, and a sustainable environmental philosophy. In Colombia, for example, the indigenous peoples work with the cocoa plant, and in Canada and even in the States, cannabis indigenous industries are emerging. To do that, First Peoples will need land security, something we warned about. There are models coming up in St. Vincent, where 200 acres have been put aside for traditional farmers who are linked to the medical cannabis industry within a legal framework. And we should be thinking of these kinds of innovative pathways, reimagining community property rights. But even as I advocate for concrete land and resources for First Peoples, I am conscious that other indigenous who fought hard and won rights are once again being threatened with modern challenges, a different kind of plunder. As a former rapporteur of indigenous peoples at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I saw firsthand these threats and had to represent many of them to sustainability and even life. Today, indigenous peoples in our region are still being displaced, some are being murdered, especially when confronted with the aggressive pursuit of extractive industries at all costs. When forgotten land suddenly becomes valuable. In Brazil, life-giving forests are being burnt down, life-giving water resources are being stolen all across the region, sacred land being targeted for superficial touristic exploits in America. The First Nations in the US all have these threats. I visited Arizona and saw the threatened land near the Grand Canyon. The Mapuche in Chile being tortured and even murdered. Belize, Guyana, Suriname, everywhere these threats are rising. And Canadian companies have often been at the forefront of this new age plunder. It involves a rethinking, and we've tried to work with this, of legal concepts of sovereignty and state responsibility over private actors to sort of rein in and regulate. Governments are often apathetic, or worse, they sometimes enable and empower big business in land and water wars. Police are sometimes employed to protect the business, not the indigenous peoples, even on their own land. And I have no doubt that once our First Peoples begin to successfully pursue a sustainable green development plan, there will be predators who will covet the green gold, just as happened elsewhere in the region. The state, NGOs, all of us will have to protect these communities. We need to be champions for them. Intellectual property will also be very important in the thrust towards sustainability, to harness the traditional knowledge bases of our First Peoples by providing them with concrete tools of law to better protect and preserve their own interests and resources. Our faculty had a successful workshop on this last year to equip our First Peoples. Once this green revolution gets going, there will be spin-offs, different innovative products to complement the wealth of indigenous knowledge products that we already have. And we don't want them to be stolen, because in our world, things do not have value unless possessed, signed, sealed, and delivered, which perhaps goes against the philosophy of indigenous. So we have to act now, this time to prevent not just physical rape, but the rape of their ideas, their very identity. So these are important legal tools as well. As you heard from Chief, work is already ongoing in terms of cultural traditions and medicine and so on that First Peoples already have. And this will also help in attracting funding if we can use intellectual property law to safeguard. The increasing focus on economic, social, and cultural rights is also important to indigenous peoples. The right to livelihood, sustainable livelihood, one in which the approaching environment is key. And again, we've had a number of cases in the international arena, the Mapuche peoples, the construction of the transoceanic canal, Nicaragua, the Sarayaku, the Saramacca. These protected rights to prior informed consent and genuine consultation. They ensure that environmental assessments had been done in the projects proposed for indigenous peoples' lands. And these principles will become even more important in future generations as we fight to control our destiny, if we really are going to reclaim and protect and harness First Peoples. These are not utopian islands. It's not some airy-fairy thing. We have seen where UN Global Food Report is telling us that many of our plant species vital for feeding the world is already becoming extinct. You might say we have lost the battle because of our emphasis on oil and gas and the consequent poor management of the environment, with all due respect, but it is not too late. Moving forward, we will need to have a very coherent and consistent policy, holistic, for a green economy. You have to prevent the oil spills that kill the fish, the preservation of the water resources, and so on in this new path of sustainability. So what better time to be re-examining how we can learn from our First Peoples practices and philosophies and devise impactful strategies grounded in law to save our, using law as an important tool, hard law. I think also we need to continue, as Chief said, the struggle against the threat of extinction, perhaps not physically, but the loss of identity and culture. For sustainability and food security to thrive, the communities themselves have to be strong. Preserving culture and unique practices and preserving the environment that supports livelihoods provide a gateway to sustaining a people and a nation. In Trinidad and Tobago, much work needs to be done still to reverse the invisibilization. Right here in Arima, we have Indigenous peoples who are still disconnected with the community. Let us not also forget the poverty and gender dimensions. Across the world, Indigenous peoples are among the most marginalized and poor, but we know that COVID has exacerbated that, and we have to work towards that to be more inclusive, including other Indigenous groups at the world. So I think now and more than ever, we need to learn from our Indigenous peoples. We need to embrace them and their philosophies for sustainable developmental goals. Our very survival may depend on it as we remember our ancestors and our First Peoples and their loving embrace and care of the earth, using law as a weapon to build and uplift and not to destroy as in the past. Thank you so much. And now I turn to another friend and neighbor, this time from Suriname. We will be getting a cultural presentation from Suriname, our leader, Aubrey Christian, and of course a greeting in that. So I turn over to Suriname. We are very delighted to have you with us. Please ensure that your mic is unmuted.
All right. Mic is unmuted. Oh yeah, unmute the mic in a Zoom. Yeah.
We're hearing you loud and clear. Suriname.
Good morning from Suriname. We will short presentation, especially for our youth, and the message to our leader and the world. And after that, we will have a prayer by the youth and a short presentation, also open presentation by the two cultural groups that are representing Suriname, the cultural group Wayono and Yukuyong Mamaro.
Aubrey,
Yes.
I'm going to ask our Zoom presenters just temporarily to mute your mics and take off your cameras so that we can allow the bandwidth, I think it's called, to give a clearer presentation. So colleagues on the Zoom, can you please mute your mics and turn off your camera just temporarily? Thank you. Then go ahead, Suriname.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ituaki Mayana in Today I open my heart and my mind with appreciation for my ancestors. To all my ancestors, both and I honor the death on my ancestors who journeyed before me. This day I open my heart and my mind with appreciation for Mother Earth. May spiritual awakening of me be the cause for celebration in the generations before and after me. Through me, may healing come in our family, in our community, on earth, in our world. Shaped by our indigenous identity, cultural heritage, sustainable living, and connection to our lands, we have much to contribute to our time, indigenous youth and employment introduced far from home. Indigenous youth have many periods
So we are having a bit of a problem, as you would see, our audience. I think we can probably post.
Okay.
Yeah, we get it. Got it back. Yes.
Yeah. Over appropriate education in their own languages, illiteracy and dropout rates, discrimination, forced relocation and loss of land, environmental pollution, unemployment, lack of legal protection, massive migration towards the cities, traffic and sexual exploitation, lack of healthcare issues, depression, suicide, and self-harm. Despite the incredible challenges, indigenous young people are the bearers of the diversity and cultural richness of our peoples and driving positive change in our communities from within. It is a mistake to think of us as victims rather than actual survivors with an enormous potential for transformation. Indigenous youths are able to walk between both worlds. We therefore need to nurture, support, and tap into this incredible potential indigenous youth possess. So today, on this day, I call upon the national the world and indigenous United Nations youth with skills to engage. We need to interact with indigenous people and voice national and international policy and decision making. This is important for the benefit of indigenous people themselves as well as their communities and societies as a whole. Guyana legend of spirit is not different. It is
Okay. So thank you, our friends from Suriname. I think we got most of it. Indeed, indigenous peoples are not victims. There's incredible potential for transformation, and I want to remind our audience that the indigenous peoples of Suriname were among the first in the world to challenge the world legal order and to reclaim rights in some very landmark cases. I mentioned one, Saramaka. So thank you for your resilience and your strength going forward. I am still seeing the community. It would seem that we are still having them on, but you know, we are in a new world order. We have this Zoom and related Zoom. It's improving every day, but it's still not perfect. We are grateful that at least we can have the presence of the Suriname peoples with us, although we didn't hear every word that they said. They're with us in spirit, and hopefully at the end we can try again for them to do the cultural presentation. But this is how we work these days amidst the COVID pandemic, but I'm still grateful and thankful that we were able to have you with us. So I believe that we would now move on then to Guatemala, the indigenous peoples of Guatemala, who have lots of history and struggle and also triumph, I would say, in terms of the indigenous peoples. We have with us Fermin Azu, who will bring some remarks. Over to you, Mr. Azu. From Guatemala. And you need to unmute your mic. You are muted. Great. Welcome.
Mabuga, Umsungu Beyagia, Ricardo, Chief Ricardo, Hausung Anigu, Sereme Labureme, Mabuga Wadimalugia. We as Garifuna people living in the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, thanks to the Creator, we have not been affected health-wise by COVID-19. And those of us that have maintained our forefathers' way of survival during moments like this, thanks to the Creator Baba, our rich soil and the land where we are have guaranteed our sustainability when it comes to our food. There's no road access from the mainland of Guatemala into the area where we are living. The only way is by sea, which has affected most of those that have wholly depended on the system to obtain their gastronomic needs. Now, it seems that this pandemic is a learning lesson for the world, but mostly for the indigenous people. So we could go back to the way like our forefathers living a healthy life. The government of Guatemala is implementing self-sustainability projects for those that own lands through nonprofit organizations. But we all know how politics works. Like Brother Roy stated, we as Garifuna people, even though we have been in Central America all these years, we're still struggling. That's why it is always a pleasure to be part of a conference like this, so we could have our voice uplifted because of the needs that we have as people. Looking forward to be back in Trinidad and Tobago next year, so we could move forward with First People's mission and vision. We have in our community gone back to our herbal medicines, so it has helped to avoid this pandemic that throughout Guatemala has been affecting, but in Livingstone, Isabel, where the Garifuna community is located, we have been blessed, and even the government asking themselves, how come those people who survived from 1797, when they were sent out of St. Vincent through Central America, still surviving this pandemic, because we have a way of doing what we need to do. We believe in the mother nature, and I think that has been to our advantage as people on this earth. I could not have missed this conference, because seeing you all and hearing all the message is uplifting my spirit to continue with you all, and so that way we could establish something for the generation to come. Mabuga, Wamagaya, Mabuga, hoping to see you next year, if not before that.
Yes.
Thanks to the Creator.
Thank you.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. I think we should have invited the Minister of Health to this conference because you seem to have the secret to fight COVID-19 and you could have shared with us, but it seems as though it's because of your natural way of life and sustainable living, and that's how you, this lesson in survival that you're talking about. Thank you so, so much. I now turn to our special guest speaker or feature address for today, who is Professor Maximillian Forte out of Concordia University in Canada. He's a professor in anthropology at that university, Montreal, Canada. But he's also an honorary Caribbean Trinbagonian. For the past 25 years, he has been engaged in historical and ethnographic research of the indigenous peoples of the Lesser Antilles, the main focus being on Trinidad and Tobago. He teaches courses on Caribbean history and political economy and the indigenous resurgence and globalization. Max has published 2 books on the Amerindians of Trinidad, plus 3 edited collections on indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the Americas, in addition, of course, to his many other scholarly publications. Very importantly, he lived and studied in Trinidad for a total of 7 years. I wouldn't give away his secret, I'm sure he'll tell you how come. And is also a graduate, we are very proud of that, of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine as well. I spoke earlier of the need for anthropological evidence in establishing legal rights for indigenous peoples. In Belize, we had the work of the United Nations, James Ayana. I venture to say that Maximillian Forte is our James Ayana. He has been perusing the archives and doing the groundwork to make visible the lost heritage of our first people. Not an easy task, as he would explain. And we are so very privileged and honored to have him with us as our featured speaker. Over to you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much, and greetings to all of you. Well, we meet today on October 12th at the intersection of 2 colossal processes, one being the enduring legacy of the forced entry of Europe into what we now call the Caribbean, represented by the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Bahamas 528 years ago on this day, and all of the subsequent transformations of the Caribbean environment entailed in what is now known as the Columbian Exchange. And the other being a pandemic that has us locked down in our respective territories and homes, and is itself, at the very least, an indirect outcome of the kind of globalizing world that was put in motion and made possible by Western colonization. Now, certain actors and interests in the global north that have awakened to the political and economic impacts of rising toxicity, skyrocketing cancer rates, and the advance of numerous lifestyle diseases, most of which are at least partly the byproduct of economic globalization, are starting to urgently, even innocently ask, what can we do to repair the damage we have done? And can we do so without imperiling the project of globalization? Can we make globalization environmentally sustainable? And in the process, maybe we can take the world into a new phase of green structural adjustment, where Western-dominated international institutions will yet again impose the definitions, establish the ideology, set the benchmarks, and submit vulnerable nation states to new regimes of monitoring and surveillance. We can maybe do all of this and enlist indigenous peoples as the iconic ecological mascots of our program. Now, if I appear to be striking a critical tone, it's only because I ask myself where this idea of environmental sustainability came from and why indigenous peoples are being enlisted in its cause. Let's be clear, environmental sustainability is not an indigenous perspective. It does not come out of Amerindian discourses. Instead, it enters from outside the Caribbean and latches onto indigenous peoples seeking an alliance. It is something that has me worried, if anything, not to see indigenous people once again cast in the stereotypical role of what some have termed the ecologically noble savage. On the geopolitical front, we have to also understand that a global struggle over energy supply is occurring, putting at stake the political power that results from control of energy. When arguments for sustainability push for alternative sources of energy, it can mean reorienting power dynamics. By recentering energy production in the now green global north, one can downgrade emerging regional powers in the periphery that are building on oil reserves, while advancing the capital accumulation of the global north's mining conglomerates that stand to be the biggest single beneficiaries of the campaign promoting wind farms and solar panels. We might also worry about how certain goals or practices become so fetishized that they blind us to the surrounding context. In North America, as we see proletarianization reaching such an extreme that people need jobs or they cannot survive, academic and political elites start talking about building resilient communities where people can protect their food security, at least in part by cultivating community gardens, rooftop gardens, and other forms of urban agriculture. Now, it all sounds pleasant, innovative, organic, and green, and it all happens as both economic and political inequalities reach previously unimaginable extremes. Indeed, in the name of all things green, policies such as carbon taxing have further exacerbated such inequalities by placing a disproportionate share of the financial burden of sustainability on the shoulders of struggling workers. So there are many questions to be asked and to be answered, including what we mean by indigenous perspectives, which ones and when, what we mean by environmentally sustainable, and why is there a focus on building environmentally sustainable communities? I mean, is there something about communities in the Caribbean that is particularly unsustainable in environmental terms? As for the meaning of environmental sustainability, there appear to be even more definitions than there are people writing definitions. Typically, meanings range from the need to maintain natural resources, to clearly framing sustainability as a resource management program, and as one agency put it, driving innovation and not compromising our way of life. Is sustainability a question of trying to sustain an environment that has already been changed by 500 years of colonialism, capitalism, and globalization? Or is it about using environmental concerns to sustain something else? The first problem we face involves a struggle over who gets to define the problem, ascertaining the origins of the problem, and then figuring out practical and reasonable solutions. Now, I have more questions than answers, and I should also underline the fact that I'm not an environmentalist, a botanist, a zoologist, or biologist. Given how much is already known about indigenous peoples' intertwined relationships with a non-human world, the nature of their cosmologies, and knowledge of a vast range of flora and fauna, I won't even try to summarize that. I just thought I should mention these caveats before proceeding. What I want to focus on now are three dimensions of indigenous knowledge that I think have gained new prominence and even urgency in the present pandemic. One involves the long-standing question of how we manufacture problems for the world here in the West by adhering to clearly flawed dichotomous frameworks that separate humans from nature and set the two in opposition. The second concerns the need, in the case of Trinidad, to draw inspiration, strength, and practical solutions, not just from Amerindian indigenous knowledge, but from what we might call the exogenous indigenous. That is, peoples from Africa and India who brought with them not just some implements and even some seeds, but also a wealth of agricultural, horticultural, and herbal knowledge, much of which has survived and blended with other knowledge systems in the Trinidadian context. The third dimension is the recurring and still unresolved issue of food security or food insecurity, a problem laid bare in the sun by the current pandemic. Now, on the first of the dimensions I listed, let's remember that for too long, especially in Western civilization, we've nurtured an opposition between mind and body. Even worse, we have held the body hostage to the mind. What the mind wanted came first. What the body needed came maybe second. And this radical disarticulation, this dismemberment of our very being, has been at the very root of so many of our contemporary illnesses. Parallel to the mind-body dichotomy, which itself is an analog of the nature-culture dichotomy, we have inherited the animal-human distinction or division. And this ideological formula bears the imprints of the Judeo-Christian tradition, one that is incompatible with many indigenous belief systems around the world. And yet this same Eurocentric tradition underpins a great deal of contemporary environmentalist policies and definitions of sustainability. And this is something that Jasmine Murphy has pointed out very recently. She argues that we can hear the echoes of Eurocentric human nature separation in the frameworks of many conservation objectives today. Concepts such as creating sustainable forests, managing wildlife populations, and preserving wilderness as a realm separate from that of humans. We need to continue questioning the artificial boundaries we created between humans and animals. These boundaries have plagued us since the onset of settled life in so-called civilized societies. Opposing ourselves to nature, we launched an unwinnable war against it. Now, there is no evidence that on the eve of Columbus's arrival, that indigenous peoples in the region thought of themselves as separate and distinct from the natural environment. They were neither apart nor above, and certainly not superior to what we Westerners call the natural environment. The Caribbean indigenous situation within what Westerners call the natural or animal world was an intensely intimate one. It was not just a matter of living in a harmonious relationship with nature. It was about being one and the same with nature, inseparable, indivisible and indistinguishable. And we need to reinstitute this connection and the respect for this place here, wherever you live, that follows from such a connection. This is not about being friendly to the environment, respectful of it, or protecting it, all of which echoes the human nature separation. The integrated situation of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, however, was disrupted primarily by the ravages of colonialism, which has been experienced to varying degrees by indigenous societies all over the globe. Not only were their worlds often upended, but perhaps even worse, their worldviews. The fact that we are still asking ourselves the question today, how can indigenous knowledge contribute to environmental sustainability, reveals a difficulty in repairing a bridge which has been badly damaged. This difficulty cannot be switched off. Is it because too much water has passed? Is it because worldviews have changed? Whatever the case may be, not all has been lost. Just as the extinction myth has been destroyed beyond repair, so is any claim that all knowledge has been lost. And you heard Chief Ricardo give just a brief selection of an extensive knowledge system that continues to survive. So the question now, though, is not so much how Indigenous knowledge can support environmental sustainability, but what Indigenous knowledge can be allowed to do. For example, broaden democracy by inviting Indigenous participation in policy formulation, education, and practice. Expand access to resources such as land, not just for Indigenous people, but for all people interested in sustaining the life of the national community. So we need to come out of the academic sphere and move into policy. In other words, to move from theory into practice. Now, the second dimension of this presentation, and I'm going to be very brief now, concerned what I call the exogenous indigenous. Now, recall that even as Indigenous populations were battling to survive the assaults on their way of life, if not their very lives, other Indigenous people of color from the other side of the world were shuffling off the transport ships. African slaves and East Indian indentured workers were bringing with them little more than what they could carry in their heads. Some brought implements and seeds, but they had also come from cultures that were intimately intertwined with the land and the sea. Their knowledge also survives to this day, and they are, along with the native Indigenous, the keepers of Indigenous knowledge about cosmologies, herbal medicines, agriculture, and more humane alternative technologies. The third and final dimension, and I'm going to close on this, is that of food security, of national and regional food self-sufficiency, which inevitably entails resisting neoliberal globalization and free trade. Of proven benefit to the modern world are Indigenous lessons on listening to and learning from what we alienated people who drink our water out of cans, what we alienated people call the natural environment. Their knowledge urges us to revise our relationships with animals and encourages us to build autonomous, self-sustaining local agriculture. The fixation with importing a nation's food supply is not only untenable, as the pandemic reminded us, it can be politically disastrous when sanctions are imposed. There also needs to be some cultural change to combat the colonial legacy of heightened preference for foreign trash, which has you importing cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. In Grenada, some today still fondly and wisely recall the words of Maurice Bishop, Grenada's leader during the revolutionary period. Eat what you grow what you eat. Work with what's at hand. Now that is an Indigenous ethic. Never consume more than you need. That is also an Indigenous ethic. In rebuilding from this pandemic and the greater legacy of colonialism standing behind it, there needs to be a dramatic new investment in local agriculture and a national plan that includes everyone. Thanks very much for your kind patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Forte. Some very important ideas, some of them new to me to chew on. the green structural adjustment and this concept of the exogenous indigenous, yes, very important ideas, and the foreign trash as we try to build towards food security. I want to thank you too. We didn't focus on it today because of the theme, but I hope those of you listening will go out and read some of his works. As I mentioned, he has been going through the archives and has done so much anthropological historical evidence about our first peoples, especially in Santa Rosa. So very important contribution indeed, and thank you for sharing with us. As we move forward now, I want, we've been hearing from the Garifuna, and now we go to St. Vincent, where it all began. They were expelled from St. Vincent centuries ago, but they have endured and now spread across the region. We have a contribution from Patricia Fraser, but reading it would be one of my law students. She's actually from Belize, Maria Nembal Santana, and she will read the contribution from St. Vincent, the Garifuna People.
From the beautiful island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and more so the indigenous community of Sandy Bay, I bring greetings to you on behalf of the Sandy Bay Heritage Development Organization, with heartfelt thanks and appreciation for allowing me to do so. This conference is timely, as we are faced with many economic and social challenges. The sustainability of our countries is under threat due particularly to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of climate change. However, indigenous peoples have survived the atrocities committed to us, including the loss of our land under European colonization. We, the indigenous peoples, were placed in the most hostile and underdeveloped part of the land. Our isolation and underdevelopment was compounded by the fact that we were divided from the rest of the country by a river that ran dry following a volcanic eruption. That volcano is still active. Our people struggled for recognition and development and have recognized that the key to survival is to remain united. Nothing in our planet exists in an isolated way. Everything interacts with Mother Earth. Nature, human beings, and our biological diversity is all part of the same design, the origin of life. Since the beginning of creation, all species have had their remarkable role of preserving, protecting, defending, and loving their environment. This philosophy ensured that Mother Earth would be able to offer her fruits to future generations. Therefore, each of us has a specific task to preserve our existence as indigenous peoples. For us to achieve this, it is important to become a unified entity so that our voices can be heard. After all, our difficulties, obstacles, goals, aspirations, and purposes are very similar. We need to strengthen our links with the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous Peoples so that our indigenous youth can participate for the sustainability, preservation, and protection of our values, traditions, and cultural practices. On a positive note, more indigenous youth are now given opportunities to go to universities, own homes and land, and participate in sporting and other social activities. However, there is a need to highlight the production of educational materials, such as videos, textbooks, and other documents, which include indigenous teachings, language, knowledge, and wisdom concerning sustainable practices and productive activities. This will help to raise awareness among indigenous peoples, including youth and other sectors of society. Again, on behalf of the Sandy Bay Heritage Development Organization, we want to wish you well. We cannot be there physically because of COVID-19. We urge the indigenous peoples organizations in the region to network together with each other for greater recognition for all of us. God's blessings on your endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first to Patricia Fraser, who wrote those wonderful remarks, and also to our faculty of law student, Maria from Belize. And she tells me she's like most people in Belize, is part Indigenous as well, so very appropriate. Well, our next speaker is the Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Lands and Fisheries, Mr. Clarence Barrett, and I think he has a very hard task. He's been hearing all of the expectations, but I'm sure he's excited. He himself has made an important commitment toward food security and the long-promised diversity of our economy, and I have no doubt that there's a space in there for the First People, so I will allow him to tell us about it. Honorable Minister. Make sure you are unmuted. Oops. I'm hearing that his connection has dropped. So I wonder if we should go on to, let's give him a few seconds, and if not, we will go on to the next speaker. The next, which is, let's go to that. His connection seems to have temporarily dropped. So I will ask my other student, my other law student, who has a short greeting as well, from this time from the indigenous peoples of Guyana, and of course they're very well known to us, very close neighbors, living in the hinterland. I visited them many years ago, very intriguing, plenty of land there, but even that territory is challenged. And one of their leaders, Mr. Colin Klautsky, has put together for us a wonderful greeting, and to read it, to present it, would be a UE law student who has a special interest in human rights, who is from Guyana, and this is Mr. Jamal Benji. Jamal?
Thank you. An indigenous dream from Guyana. Greetings to one and all from Guyana's 9 First Nations. We express gratitude to our host for accommodating us at this forum. It can require much strength trying to relay a happy and visionary First Peoples dream for the future, not only because of today being the 528th anniversary of the beginning of the Native American Holocaust, but also at a time when the COVID-19 evil spirit that has been hovering over us for far too many moons now, and has carried far too many of our peoples too early to join the ancestors, and the horrible specter that there may be many more to follow. Still, life goes on, and we should continue to dream dreams. The pre-1492 names of the various Caribbean territories will be used throughout this message. We dream that our people will become more educated on our unique history. We need to know who we are, where we are, so that we may know where we're going. We dream that our people's wishes to be known as indigenous people, as opposed to the Columbus Indian misnomer, be respected and implemented. We dream to keep alive the visions of the 1987 founders of the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous Peoples, who must have had various creative ideas on the way forward. We dream that all our history and social studies textbook will respect, wherever applicable, what the ancestors named their lands. Examples are Yormin for St. Vincent, Watakabuli for Dominica, and Kayari for Trinidad. We dream that those regional politicians who have had plans to republicanize their respective countries take into consideration the fact that the autochthonous peoples of each territory practiced true independence for thousands of years prior to 1492. We dream that the land rights struggles of pioneering First People heroes such as Stephen Campbell of Guyana, Carb Warner of Watakabuli, Julian Chow of Belize, Hayarima of Kayari, and others will be implemented and widely taught for and given more prominence in our school textbooks. Time limits won't allow us to dream much further. May the blessings of the Great Spirit be all with you. Until we meet again, thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. And we have a short cultural presentation to top off the Guyanese contribution.
Selalu laku pimi, pimi senkama pe shibenuruya. Agomu kamambiare be senkama pe shibenuruya. Ishimro by promulentai. Kashiri, pusasraru e popo grosei. E que não queira que kashiri, pusasraru e popo grosei. O estraru e popo grosei. O estraru e popo grosei. Ai! Shibenuruya, agomu kamambiare be senkama be shibenuruya, ishimro by promulinda.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. That was wonderful. I wonder if you know that an Indigenous leader is now a member of parliament in Guyana. I hope Santa Rosa is taking note. Okay, well, our Honorable Minister of Agriculture, he is very sustainable because he's now back on. Minister, while we were trying to get you back, I was saying that you have a difficult task because you're hearing all of the requirements, expectations, but I'm sure you're excited because you can see how much wonderful work is already being done on the part of the Indigenous peoples. And I know about your own commitment towards food security and diversity. So we're hoping you can work with the First Peoples. So please take it away and tell us about your plans for the future.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to participate. I don't know if you have a version of Murphy's Law in Indigenous culture, but I was on all the time until the time I had to go on. I wanna use my time to address 4 areas, and it follows from what I've heard this morning, particularly from Professor Forte. And those 4 areas would be the legislation, National Action Plan. Chief Barrett and I have been talking about that, the components of a National Action Plan, and some of the current projects we are engaged in, particularly what Chief talked about earlier. And on the issue of the legislation, of course, it comes naturally to me to want to address that, given my profession and the fact that Professor Antoine and her husband taught me at law school at UE. I would make 6 points on the issue of the legislation. The first is to say that the current and the most recent efforts on legislation has been in relation to bring into national law the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it is an important step, but we have to be very careful that we, in adopting the declaration through national legislation, we use the appropriate language that gives us the force that it requires and gives us the commitments that we required. So mere adoption of the declaration by reference, to me, is not going to achieve what we would like to achieve. And I want to make it very clear that I speak not in terms of committing the government of which I'm a part, but in terms of giving some advice using my own experience. And I think it was Professor Forte who talked about British Columbia. And apart from my learning in history, my major interaction with First Peoples came when the firm I worked with in Canada, British Columbia, represented those former timber companies that were getting out of business on account of changes in the international market for Canadian export of lumber. And in engaging and in disengaging from the industry, the interface with First Peoples' rights was an important part of what we had to deal with. And it brought to bear in my own mind some of the significant legislative, but also the historical factors. Of course, the practice in Canada, you must do as part of your retraining as a foreign trained attorney, the course in First Peoples law. So from a legislative point of view, I would make the first point that in crafting, wherever we craft it, but particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, we must be assured that the legislation gives a level of commitment and provides some of the real benefits that I believe the First People are entitled to. I want to say that Canada tried through a private members bill in 2016, and it is interesting that even Canada, with its rich history, particularly jurisprudence from the Supreme Court, a rich history and dating back to the Indian Act, and a body of jurisprudence from the Supreme Court, Canada is still, from a federal level, trying to enact legislation that gives force to the UN Declaration. And the most recent attempts came via private members bill in 2016, with which the indigenous community had a lot of support, and it was attractive to them. But I think by virtue of being a private members bill, it had a particular lifespan and it was never brought into effect. Currently, there is an attempt through a federal bill driven by the Liberal government to enact similar legislation drawing on that 2016 private members bill. And we have to pay particular attention to that bill that is being considered. It is not, the bill itself has not been made public, but there are numerous leaks and what purports to be leaks about what is likely to be in the bill and what is available for public consumption so far. But that is something that we have to pay attention to, given Canada's rich history. But even before that, in 2019, the province of British Columbia, where I lived, and my family still live. I believe my wife is on the call, and that is because she has an interest in her role as a mentor and a career developer. She's worked with First Peoples in particular in overcoming some of the barriers that they encounter to employment. So while I have worked on the corporate and the legal side of it, she's actually worked on the education and overcoming some of the access to education barriers that First Peoples encounter, and it's widely acknowledged that they do. But the British Columbia Bill Act, it has been enacted, represents another model that we could look at, and taking into consideration, of course, the management of the issues, First People's rights or Indigenous people's right in Canada is both federal and provincial, depending on what aspect of it you're dealing with. So that is the legislation. I would say it is important that we put into place comparative legislation in Trinidad. The Canadian bill may present some ideas to us. The British Columbia bill definitely sets out for us what we may want to do if we head in that direction. The 5 important aspects of the British Columbia legislation to me, first, it is a commitment by the province to introduce measures which ensure that provincial law aligns to the declaration. But in it gives a commitment for consultation and cooperation with the First Peoples. And Professor Antoine would know that this issue of consultation and agreement is a very live issue in constitutional law. And I don't know if in following something like that, we would want stronger language. Maybe the politician in me would never support a law that requires agreement by third parties or external parties, given the government always wants to have that power, that free hand to enact legislation, but I think we may require, if we can look at the British Columbia legislation, we may require language that are more determined and purposeful and mere consultation and cooperation. The legislation also calls for the development of an action plan, and again uses the language cooperation and consultation with the indigenous people. And in any commitment to develop an action plan, we must be more, my own view is that we must be more purposeful and give a stronger commitment in the legislation. There's a requirement for annual reports, and that is to track the progress, and that is very, very significant. The annual report must be laid in Parliament, and I think that it is important that we do that so that we are able to track from a legislative point of view and a parliamentary point of view the progress, because of course reports laid in Parliament lend themselves to review and oversight by the various committees of the Parliament, and that is an important part of the oversight process, which is very robust in Trinidad and Tobago and a very important defining part of our democracy. The fourth area the legislation in British Columbia covers relates to agreements and the authorizations, the process for reaching agreements, and the process for giving effect to agreements. And then the fifth area relates to decision-making agreements and the process for that. So you have agreements, but you also have a process where you arrive at an agreement, and that covers the issue of legislation to me. The second area I want to talk about is this issue of the National Action Plan, and I want to use three words to deal with the National Action Plan, and those three words would be but towards what? What is this National Action Plan putting us, what is the path are we putting ourselves on? And Chief knows that earlier this year when we reopened the Red House, and I had the opportunity, thanks to the First Peoples, to speak at the ceremonies prior to the reopening, I talked about this issue of preeminence versus equality. And having followed in the narrative, particularly the speeches of Chief Barrett, I found that there was too much reliance on this concept of equality by the First People and not the concept of preeminence. You see, preeminence places First Peoples at first, and that is no accident that we call the First Peoples First Peoples. We acknowledge that whoever came here met the First Peoples here, and the land and whatever is to be found here belongs to the First People. Something that is widely recognized around the world, and there's sufficient case law that establishes that. So I found that, the call for equality really was not the pitch that I was supportive of. I was supportive of preeminence. In other words, recognizing that the First Peoples were here and the state has an obligation to place itself, second in line, and to deal in a purposeful, positive, and respectful way with the First People. And it was not a favor the First Peoples were asking for. It is something that I believe has been established, and we should respect that. So in relation to the national plan, I'll move to my third area, and that is the crafting of the national plan. And I think that in the crafting of the national plan, we must deal with 5 elements. And the first is that issue I just talked about, preeminence versus equality. And I think in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere where we are approaching this discussion, I think it's a constitutional matter. Following the model in Canada and other places, I think the preeminence of the First Peoples must be recognized in Constitution, and it must not be left to case law or jurisprudence or legislation, subsidiary legislation or anything like that. It must not be left to a mutually achieved agreement. I think it's a constitutional issue in which preeminence must be established, and that's the first element of a national action plan. The second is an agreement that flows from that. There are models of agreement, and an agreement that flows from that in terms of the state and the First People agreeing what does preeminence mean and what are the elements of that. And I would address the what I consider to be the 6 fundamental issues of an agreement like that. So the second element of a national action plan must be an agreement between the state and the First People. The third element of a national action plan is that the relationship between the government and the First People must be a relationship with the Office of the Prime Minister and the First People. At the present, the First People, the funding for the First People is embedded in different ministries, and in particular the ministry with respect to culture and community development. I think the Office of the Prime Minister has different, depending on what the Prime Minister wishes to have in that office, he determines that. But I think that the relationship and the agreements between the state and the First Peoples must belong in the office of the Prime Minister, and that's the third element of a national action plan that I would like to see. The fourth relates to this issue of funding and how the First People, based on that agreement, how the First Peoples are funded. The current projects, which would be the fourth area I would deal with, current projects are to be found in different line items across ministries, and I believe that should change, and the funding for the First People should be a charge on the consolidated account in the way we deal with the Office of the President, and we deal with the judiciary, and we deal with other aspects of the state. I think preeminence requires that funding be a charge on the consolidated accounts outside of the appropriation bill, which is currently being debated, for example. And the fifth part of the National Action Plan, with what I call the 6 fundamental issues to be addressed by the state. And of course, land is number 1. We gave the First People a lease for the traditional land, the 25-acre lease, and the chief has since written to me saying that they would like ownership of the land, and it is something that I support. I support that. Support not only in law but in principle in relation to the idea of preeminence, that the land should be freehold and owned by the First People, and we must address other land across the street. The second is in relation to the way in which the state pays respect and provides recognition and gives recognition to the First People, and the elements of that recognition in terms of protocol lists, in terms of invitation to state functions, and in terms of active participation in the decision making in the country. The third relates to the traditions and the culture. And in Canada, for example, we know that some of the traditions and the cultural practices were incompatible with provincial law, and some of those matters relating to fisheries, harvesting of lumber, and gambling have made their way to the Supreme Court. And in every case, the traditions and culture of the First Nation have been found to be, in priority to the provincial law or the federal law. And it is very important that we understand what are the traditions, the way in which it will conflict or likely conflict with municipal bylaws or with the laws of the land. We do not, like Canada, Canada has 4 levels of government: federal, provincial, municipal, and First Nations law. We have municipal bylaws and laws that apply nationally. The fourth area in terms of a fourth fundamental issue is this issue of education. We've seen that from a religious point of view, the religious entities, one in particular has a concord with the state, but the other religious groupings have been able to function as denominational boards in education and receive support from the state. Are we completing a First People school, a First People's curriculum, a First People, special schools for the education of the First People and the descendants of them in the country? That is a fundamental issue that we must address. The fifth I've talked about, and the quantum of the funding, the direction funding, and how are we going to protect the funding from changes in policy and in government and in leadership and so on. And the sixth has to do with this issue of perpetuation. We cannot leave it that, you know, a government comes in that is favorable, or a minister comes in that is very favorable. A funding is made available this year, but not next year. And how do we perpetuate? How do we establish the First Peoples and their preeminence in our society in a way that it is non-negotiable, and it perpetuates itself across the country via legislation, via policies, via the structure of the society, the governance of the society. And the final thing I'll talk about is this issue of the projects. And all I've said relates to the theme, which is sustainability and the environment. Because we could talk all day about protection of the environment and being kind to the land and growing eating what we grow and growing what we eat and supporting ourselves sustainably. We could talk about that, and that is an important discussion. But at the root of it is the placement of the First Peoples in our society and the respect and the recognition that we give to our First Peoples. The last area, as I said, our project is of course the center and the facilities for the First People in Arima. It is the land issue has been settled insofar as it's been made available. There are issues around it that we have to settle, and of course the call for outright ownership, and as I said, a call that I support. But with the projects comes those other issues that I raise, which is the inconsistency of the funding, inconsistency of the pace of the funding, questions about availability, support across ministries. Each ministry has a role to play. Agriculture has a component. I have committed to my component of it. I think it is very, very important. The more time I spend with Chief Barrett, the more time I spend on this issue of First People, the more convinced and more determined I am as a leader to ensure that we do right. So I'm committed to the component that I have, but we have to make sure that at the highest level in the country, there is commitment not only for this fiscal year, but the fiscal years that follow, because it is very important, not just part of our education process in the country, but it is very important for Trinidad and Tobago to take its place alongside the other nations in this world, that we settle once and for all this issue of respect and recognition. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to make this contribution.
Thank you so much, Minister. You would have seen that I allowed you extra time because
I did. I thought I was less than.
No, but what you were saying is so important, and I think very encouraging news indeed. The legislation, the National Action Plan, and I'm particularly excited about the School of Indigenous Peoples. I spoke earlier of using hard law to concretize rights for Indigenous peoples and using that as a platform for sustainable development. And it's so good to hear some concrete plans. Yes, the Canada model would be useful, and the concept of consent is key over your own land. So hopefully the Indigenous peoples will have their own land and more than the 25 acres. It's not a favor, as you rightly said, but a right. We can move forward. We don't need to go to the courts to challenge it. Funding is key. So I think everybody is really, really excited to hear what you're saying and to understand the notion of respect in that advice. So now I want to turn now to we're going to have another cultural presentation. This time we're going to our friends in Dominica, also close to us, Indigenous peoples there. Anybody who's been to Dominica has visited Indigenous peoples. We will first have some greetings from Chief Lorenzo Sanford and then a cultural presentation. Chief Lorenzo Sanford. I believe we have it on video because, yes, here we go.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for listening. I would like to say thank you and congratulations.
We need a bit more volume.
Mr. Chief Hernandez Ricardo Barrett for celebrating the Hayarima Indigenous Festival this year in Trinidad. I know we the Indigenous people have suffered much and are still limited by the pandemic or COVID-19. So I would like to say thank you to everyone here who is listening to this message. And I look forward that we, the indigenous people of the Caribbean and the Americas, that we can be more united with each other and understand and share different traits. And though we may feel limited by this pandemic, that we may liaise with each other and connect with each other so that we can make a better life for all Kalinago people and every indigenous people here and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, leader of the Kalinago. And we have another leader from Dominica who will lead us with the cultural presentation, Mr. Gerald Angwe, the cultural presentation and dance, I believe it is. Yeah.
Okay, Mabrika, to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, Mabrika, and I would just like to acknowledge Chief Ricardo and the people of Arima, the visiting contingent or the people viewing over the internet. I would like to acknowledge Belize, Guyana, Suriname, Canada, and Guatemala, and all the other countries viewing over the internet. I would just like to say greetings and blessings from Waitukubuli, Dominica. So today we have, of course, the Carina Cultural Group. Every year we usually visit Trinidad, Shaliabi, and we usually enjoy ourselves in this beautiful island. But unfortunately this year, because of the COVID, we have to do things differently. Waitukubuli and Shaliabi, of course, we have a proud history, and over the past, over 400 years ago, we had a chief by the name of Apokoraima, a chief from Shaliabi, who had a daughter by the name of Babi. She was captured and she was brought to Waitukubuli. And then she went to Liamiga, St. Kitts. She had a son with the governor, fell in love, of course, and had a son with the governor of Liamiga. This boy grew up, and then after his father died, he came back to Waitukubuli and then became the chief of Waitukubuli. And in 1664, of course, he became the governor of the island. And in 1674, he was murdered by his half-brother. So we have a proud history between the two islands, Shaliabi, Trinidad, and Waitukubuli, Dominica. So right now, of course, we are the Carina Cultural Group, and we are going to perform. We're going to do a dance, a special dance that we call the Maruka Dream Dance. So ladies and gentlemen, enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Well, it was great. It certainly livened up things. And it's so well, you know, I published and said it that my secret here, Dominica is one of my favorite places. And it's so good to see that you're recovering from the hurricane, you know, resilience, surviving, great. So we are now coming to the end, or we have come to the end, I should say, of our very special session this morning with the First Peoples of Santa Rosa and their celebration of Heritage Week. The other events, there's a documentary being produced and soon we'll be hearing about it in honor of this week and their contributions. I've been so privileged on behalf of the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, to partner with the First Peoples, the Santa Rosa First Peoples. I congratulate them and all of the Indigenous peoples, and I want to thank all of those this morning who made, I think, this session short and sweet, and I believe a great success and a great learning experience. Thank you to all of our dignitaries, Minister Rambarath and Minister Beckles, Member of Parliament for Rima, our very special feature speaker, Professor Maximillian Forte, for his words today, urging us on, but also for all of the important work that he has done in the past to uplift Indigenous peoples in our region. All of our many Indigenous leaders from across the region and the communities shared with us today that made this event so special. I want to also mention Ms. Nancy Robinson, who herself is a Garifuna, but she works and lives with the Santa Rosa First Peoples, who helped us with the organization. Our marketing, hardworking marketing and communications department, especially Chanel Robinson. The media for covering the event. My own Alicia Phillips, my admin assistant in the Faculty of Law at UE. And you, the virtual audience, for tuning in your numbers. I have been reading some of the comments in between. It's not so easy to sort of maneuver, but I saw it as a lot of many comments and great interest, and I thank you for that interest and for your support. We can do this together, as I said earlier. First Peoples will need champions as we move forward to a more sustainable development. So thank you, everyone. Go forth, and as Roy told us, I for you and you for me. Let us do this together. Thank you and good day.
Thank you. Very well. We have problems with it.